I am very pleased to be able to introduce Professor Daniel Peterson. For those of you who have attended this conference in the past, you've heard from him before. He is a wonderful member of the faculty here. He is a native of Southern California, received his bachelor's degree in Greek and philosophy from BYU, and after several years of study in Jerusalem and Cairo, earned his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures from the University of California at Los Angeles, otherwise known as UCLA. Dr. Peterson is a professor of Islamic Studies in Arabic at BYU, served as a member of the board, Associate Executive Director and Co-Director of Research for the university's Institute for the Study and Preservation of Ancient Religious Texts, now renamed the Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship. This wonderful organization has produced a computer digitized version of the Dead Sea Scrolls, electronically recovered damaged documents from the ruins of Herculaneum and Petra and elsewhere, and has engaged in joint publishing ventures with such institutions as the Vatican Apostolic Library in Rome. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of BYU's four-part Middle Eastern Texts Initiative, which includes not only the Islamic translation series, which you would be familiar with, but also a number of classical works that include medieval Arabic and Persian philosophy, Arabic medicine and science, and early Syriac and Christian Arabic literature, all distributed by the University of Chicago Press. He is the author of several books and numerous articles on Islamic and Latter-day Saint topics, including this little gem that I hold in my hand. This is Muhammad, Prophet of God. An interesting title by a Latter-day Saint, don't you think?
I can choose it.
This is newly published this year by the William B. Erdman's Publishing Company. I have to tell you that this book is available broadly, but more particularly on Amazon.com for $10.20. And if you order over $25, it is eligible for free Super Saver shipping. You might persuade him to sign some of these afterwards, I don't know. He has lectured across the United States, in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and at various universities in the Near East and Asia. And I didn't introduce who I am. I'm with Church Public Affairs. Professor Peterson has been very helpful to the public affairs work in various parts of the world, particularly in Asia, which is an area that I'm concerned with. He served in the Switzerland Zurich mission and for approximately 8 years on the Gospel Doctrine Writing Committee for the Church. He currently serves on the High Council of a student stake here at BYU. He's immediate past chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, also known as FARMS. Now sits on the Directors Council of the Maxwell Institute and edits the FARMS Review. He is married to the former Deborah Stevens of Lakewood, Colorado. They are the parents of 3 sons. On a interesting note, if you Google Daniel C. Peterson, you get a real mixed bag of results. Some of it's good and some of it's bad. His name is spoken of both for good and evil, depending on who you ask. And the fact that he has detractors, one, by the way, has not so affectionately labeled him Danny Boy, is testimony to his consistent willingness over many years to staunchly defend the truth and to provide truth seekers with thoughtful responses to their honest questions. I want to offer my personal thanks for his willingness to speak to us today, and also for his tremendous lifelong preparation and for his candor and courage in defending the truth, and would ask you to join me in welcoming him as our guest speaker.
Thank you very much. I hadn't seen anybody referring to me as Danny Boy. That's nice, because that's actually the song that my mother named me for. So, what do you make of that? I see the title that I'm supposed to talk about is Muslims and Christians, the Troubled Interface. this is an interesting title, and it's both accurate and inaccurate in the sense that that there are Christian elements and Muslim elements involved in this uneasy relationship between the two civilizations, and there are also other elements that have nothing to do with the religions. And I'm going to give you kind of a scattershot, grab bag, impressionistic picture of what I see as some of the major problems interfering with relations between Muslims and Christians, between the West and the so-called Islamic world. I've tried to put this in a kind of order. I don't know if it really fits in any order. And so I'll just give you these thoughts for what they're worth, and there may be other things I should have thought of but didn't. There are plenty of reasons for an uneasy relationship between the two civilizations. One is simply the normal religious disagreements. The religions disagree on a number of issues, and so naturally there's going to be conflict. I would say, in fact, that there's going to be greater conflict precisely because we share theological territory than if we didn't. There is not a great deal of conflict between Buddhists and Christians. That's because Buddhism and Christianity inhabit, in a sense, two separate worlds. But Islam and Christianity claim the same territory, doctrinally, theologically, historically. Islam makes claim to the prophets from Adam through Abraham, Moses, Noah, Jesus, the same tradition that Judaism and Christianity lay claim to. And so, because of this shared but disputed territory, we have had fights over the years. And that's related to the fact that because the Islamic world and the Christian world share geographical borders, we've had conflicts. There have not been conflicts on the whole between, until recently, when borders seem to matter less and geographical separation matters less. There haven't been disputes or wars between, say, Europe and China, or the United States and China, because they didn't share territory, they didn't have any common ground or disputed ground on which to fight. But the Islamic world has always shared a border with the Western world, with Christendom. And so, of course, there have been battles all along the periphery since the rise of Islam. And the memory of this among Muslims is strong. For example, the Crusades. The Crusades still loom large in Islamic consciousness. Osama bin Laden, for example, describes the people he's fighting as the Zionists and the Crusaders. Now, ironically, if you read the Arab and Islamic chronicles from the actual time of the Crusades, they didn't matter much. The Muslims hardly noticed them. They were a pinprick. They weren't very significant. It was a time of instability in the Islamic world, and there were lots of small states, and the existence of a Latin Crusader kingdom, for example, a very small one, didn't really make a big impression on them. They didn't think about it a lot. The Crusades have loomed larger with the passage of time as an expression, as it's seen from the Islamic side, of Western imperialism, which has continued ever since then. And so this can lead to really interesting phenomena. There was the case you may remember a few years ago where President Bush, right after 9/11, described the United States as being engaged in a crusade against evil. Now, for most of us, the word crusade has long since lost any real association with the Crusades. And we don't think anymore of the word crusade being connected with the word cross, which is actually its etymological origin. But when this was translated into Arabic, Bush was talking about the Crusades, the Hurub as-Salibiyin, the wars of the cross people. Okay? So we were engaged in a cross-related war against the Islamic world. And of course, people who heard that went absolutely ballistic. The fact is that memory has grown in intensity over the years and serves as one of the things that divides the Islamic world from the West. They feel, quite ahistorically in a way, that the Crusades represent an unprovoked attack on the Islamic world by Western imperialists. Now, actually, there were some Islamic things going on that helped to set the stage for that. But that, as always, is forgotten. On the whole, though, the Crusades were a pretty obvious venture of Western imperialism, and so they linger on in memory for that. There's also the memory of colonialism, that starting with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, really actually earlier than that with certain Russian incursions into Islamic lands in Central Asia and attacking the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim states have been under attack from imperialist Western societies. Now, the irony here is that to a large extent, the Western societies engaged in colonialism and imperialism in the 19th century and even into the 20th were Britain and France, not the United States. But the United States has come to inherit the blame for that in a sort of strange twist of historical fate, it seems to me. The real irony for me is that on the whole, the French imperialist venture in the Middle East was far more noxious and toxic than the British one. I won't comment further on that. I like France. There's also the problem of mutual ignorance. The fact is that we don't know a great deal about the Islamic world, and they don't know a great deal about us. Now, there have been some studies done recently, well, not so recently, in the past 5 or 10 years, that have illustrated how very little Muslims knew during the classical period and even beyond about Europe and the West. They knew about classical Greece. They knew to a certain extent about Rome. They had inherited a great deal of science and mathematics and medicine and so on from them. But they really didn't know much about Europe as Europe came to be, particularly after the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, all that sort of thing. Amazingly little knowledge. Why? Because the Islamic world was secure, one might say smug and complacent, in its superiority. They felt that they had attained a superior status, guaranteed by their religious faith, and that they would remain in that status forever. So there was really no point in paying attention to inferior civilizations. That strikes me as something from which we might learn a profitable lesson now, because I think, if anything, the arrogance, the smugness, and the superiority and complacency may have transferred itself to the West, which now sees itself, again, quite ahistorically, as having attained the summit of human experience and power, which it's assumed will always remain so. But if history teaches anything, it's that societies rise and fall, civilizations prosper and decline, and the current Western domination of the world is probably not destined to last, at least if past experience is any guide. At one point in his greatest book, the Muqaddimah, the introduction to his world history, Ibn Khaldun is surveying the world, and he's talking about the great things that are going on in China, that China's contributed to the world, great things in India, the great things in the Byzantine Empire, and so on. Then he comes to Europe, and he says, as for Europe, Allahu A'lam, God knows. There's probably nothing of any value going on there. This is the end of the 14th century, so the late 1300s. It's just about the time that Europe is beginning to stir, that Europe is beginning to come alive. But Ibn Khaldun, probably the most acute observer in the Islamic world, is paying no attention. And people less acute than he were paying no attention at all. And so they simply missed what was coming along. Now, as I say, the West has now gotten into this position where we, by and large, until recent events have provoked us, have not known much about the Islamic world. The Muslims were over there. They're not something we have to concern ourselves with. They're a primitive, backward civilization. They certainly have no impact on us. We don't have to pay any attention. It reminds me of the definition of war, the word war, in Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary. War, he said, is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Now, I think there's an element of truth in that. At least now in my classes, I can actually presume the students know where the Middle East is. I couldn't always do that. But we still labor under certain misconceptions. We have tended, until recently at least, to think of Islam as a monolith. We're now learning in a rather cruel fashion that it's not. For example, we've heard about the Shiite and Sunni divide. But this problem works both ways, and I'm trying to be as even-handed here as I can be. I think of the ignorance in the Islamic world of the West. There is a major problem, for example, of Islamic illiteracy, or illiteracy in the Islamic world. The Arab world, for example, is largely an oral culture. People don't read much. There have been a number of articles on the sorry state of publishing in the Arab world. It's pathetic. The number of books issued, the number of titles printed, is exceedingly low. I've meant to look up the statistic. I couldn't find it when I was looking for it, but I've run across it before. It's staggering. The number of books translated from Western languages into Arabic, for example, is unbelievably low. For all of the Arab countries put together, the number of books translated into Arabic from Western languages is smaller than the number of books translated from Western languages into Greek. We're talking here about a relatively small country. And so they are on the whole unaware of what's going on even now in the Western world. And much of what they know, as Will Rogers says, isn't so. There was a really instructive case a number of years ago, quite a number of years ago now. I was reading about Abul Hassan Bani Sadr. Some of you may recall him as the first president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. There were some people who thought when he came to the presidency that he would be more open to the West than, say, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was not open at all, because he had studied at the Sorbonne. He'd done a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris, and so surely he understood the West and would be a helpful influence. It turned out, as people began to learn more about him, that yes, he had done a PhD at the Sorbonne, but his life in Paris had been entirely restricted to his apartment, the library, and the lecture hall. He had seen nothing. He attended nothing. He learned French, but he never understood French life or Parisian life. And so, in a sense, it really hadn't done him much good, it seems to me. Now, I wish that that Islamic concerns about the West were all built on ignorance, but they're not. Because one of the things that is an obstacle to perceptions, or to any urge to build a relationship with the West and the Islamic world, is a perception of Western decadence. And this, alas, is not entirely fictional or based on imagination. One of the experiences I had living in the Middle East, especially in early years, was once in a while when Cairo was too much with me, and I simply couldn't stand it anymore. My wife and I would go to one of the big Cairo movie halls to see an American film. And they have the old kind of movie palaces that we don't build anymore, the really vast theaters, and you'd be sitting there with an audience entirely of Arabs watching an American movie. I don't know, you've probably had the experience of taking an investigator to church and suddenly you become acutely aware of all the really weird people in your ward. And you're thinking, oh, please no, don't let Sister so-and-so talk to him. And then you look at the program, to your horror, Brother so-and-so is the speaker. I remember taking some investigators on my mission to the church in Basel, Switzerland, and the sole speaker, the only speaker on the program, was a man who devoted most of his speech to the question of the resurrection of insects. I couldn't believe it. Neither could they. They never came back, and I really honestly couldn't blame them. If I hadn't been a member, I probably wouldn't have come back either. It was pretty bizarre. Well, anyway, you sit there in one of these movie theaters, and suddenly you're acutely aware of the messages about your society that these movies are sending. You learn certain things, like, daily life in the United States is punctuated with street fights, gun battles, car chases. What does it say about the morality of Americans? And you realize these are not propaganda films produced by our enemies. These are produced by us, shown in the Islamic world, and they believe it. Why shouldn't they? This is how we're depicting life in our own society, and so they're appalled by it, and they're very much turned off. Whoops, I just remembered something I want to share with you. On the other hand, they are excited and interested by the West. And so I want to say something about this concept of the great Satan that you hear about. Now, the Satan that they're thinking of is not simply the Lord of Evil, the master of lies and so on. He's certainly not the guy dressed up in a red suit with a tail and horns. He's a seducer. And this, I think, leads to some of the anxiety about the West, that the West is not only repulsive, but the West is attractive. And so this leads to an explosive psychological situation where people find themselves being lured in and seduced and hate themselves and hate the West for doing it to them. Now, the last surah, the last chapter of the Quran, is called the Surah of the People, Surah An-Nas. And I want to read it to you because I think it says something about the nature of Satan. First, I'll translate it for you. It starts off as all but one of the surahs in the Quran do, with "In the name of God, the merciful and compassionate." And then it says, "Say," it's addressing Muhammad, "Say, I take refuge with the Lord of the people, the King of the people, the God of the people, from the evil of the accursed whisperer, who whispers in the hearts of the people, among the jinn and the people." And it's quite repetitious. But I want you to hear it in Arabic, because it says something about their image, I think, of the United States as the great Satan. What is Satan like? Listen, I'm going to emphasize one sound. You'll hear it. Okay, it starts off, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Qul a'udhu bir-Rabb an-Nas, Malak an-Nas, Ilah an-Nas, min shar al-wiswas al-khanas, alladhi yuwaswisu fi sudur an-Nas, min al-jinni wan-Nas. Do you hear that sound? It's the snake. It's the serpent. It's the serpent in the garden, who's luring you in with sweet words and so on. Who is dangerous precisely not because he's so obviously evil, but because he is seductively evil. sort of subterraneously evil in a way. The evil is hidden, it's cleverly disguised. But because of that, the West both appalls and frightens them because it's a genuine threat. Nobody in the old days was in the Middle East was seduced by the Soviet Union. At least not very many were. You couldn't be. The Soviet Union with its gray socialist realism, its gray big buildings, its sort of dismal economic record, it was not an attractive thing. But the United States is attractive and therefore much, much more dangerous. Even though the Soviet Union was overtly atheistic, it wasn't the threat to Islam, to Muslims, as they saw it, that the West is. Okay, I need to get through a lot of other things here too. Just to mention them really is going to take a lot of time. One of the things that I think leads to strife between the West and the Islamic world is Muslim frustration. You have to understand that Islam sees itself, and I'm going to put it in Mormon terms, but this is the concepts are essentially the same. Islam sees itself as the dispensation of the fullness of times. It's the final revelation. Islam has a dispensational view of history. God has revealed himself in times past, but every time there's been an apostasy. Now, for the last time, the Lord has spoken again through his prophet Muhammad. Okay? And this faith is going to roll forth until it fills the whole earth. Until the whole earth is full of the knowledge of God, as the waters cover the sea, right? Again, borrowing Christian language, but the concepts are the same. Now, the fact is that for many, many years, Islam seemed to be on the road to doing that. Within a century of the Prophet's death, they were in Spain, they were over on the borders of India, and Islam continued to expand rapidly. And then it slowed down, and then it began, in a sense, to reverse. And Islamic civilization, which had been for sometime the most advanced civilization on the globe, giving us advanced mathematics and philosophy and science and everything else, it now finds itself backwards. It finds itself not at the cutting edge of civilization, but dependent. There's a disparity, educationally, academically, economically, between the Western world and Islam. In fact, as Bernard Lewis has pointed out, if you were to take away fossil fuels and then put together all of the other economic productivity of the entire Arab world and put it together into one thing that you might call Arabistan, Arabistan would have a GNP just slightly higher than that of Finland. Now that is extremely worrisome to Islamic and Arab and regional thinkers who give this any attention. Many don't, but those who do are very worried about this. There's a sense they've simply fallen behind. The Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, denounced the West, but when he came back out of his exile in France, he flew back in a Boeing 747. He landed at Mehrabad Airport and drove into the city in a Chevrolet. And then he spoke on microphones manufactured in the West. There was nothing manufactured in the East, and there still isn't much along those lines, and they're acutely aware of that. There's an Islamic sense of humiliation, that something has gone seriously wrong. Now, the problem is that this often takes the form of anger. Their response takes the form of anger, because they feel that right now they're in the stage of assuming that, well, someone has done it to them. And it's very hard to recover from a bad situation like this when you objectify the blame for it, place it on forces outside yourself. It's not that I have a problem; it's that someone has done me wrong, and so I have to fight against that. Now, this Middle Eastern anger comes through in a lot of ways. I had a really unpleasant, frustrating experience a while back on the island of Malta. I belong to a group that, for obvious reasons, calls itself the Malta Group. Because we met the first time in Malta, and the object of this is to bring representatives of the Arab world together with representatives of the Western world to try to find some common ground, about 8 or 10 people on each side. And we're meeting again next month in the Costa del Sol in Spain, which is the only thing that makes the prospect tolerable. For me, I think it's going to be another exercise in total frustration because we simply talk past each other. Let me tell you briefly about this experience in Malta. The plan, I thought, was a very good one. The idea was to try to find common ground, not to talk about current events, but to lay the groundwork for a common framework of discussion about current events. And the thing that we chose to do, starting off, was to talk about what's called just war theory. There's a body of doctrine that's grown up out of the medieval Catholic theologians and then early lawyers like Hugo Grotius and so on. about what constitutes a just war. How do you decide when a war is just? You do this on the basis of principles like proportionality of force to ends, targeting or non-targeting civilians, the legal competence of the authority that declared it, and so on and so forth. And they're pretty reasonable rules, by and large. So we thought we could sit down with this group of Muslim, or I should say Arab intellectuals, some of them were communist atheists, but sit down with them and find common ground, and then we could proceed from that to talk about current issues. We never got anywhere near the current issues. Well, no, I should say we got to them immediately. That's more accurate. Immediately, people began saying, "You're here to justify the Israeli occupation of Palestine." We said, "No, actually, we're not. We don't want to talk about that at all right now." And I tried to point out that, look, I'm actually somewhat critical of Israeli policy in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But we want to talk about that later. Let's see if we can agree on these principles. You want to justify the American invasion of Iraq. And basically, we were speaking at one another, we were giving speeches to one another. It was an exceedingly frustrating discussion. And I've been in a number of those. Right now, it's very, very hard for people to calm down and talk to one another. It's not only a matter of language differences, though that was an obstacle there because the Americans didn't speak Arabic and most of the Arabs didn't speak English, and so every speech had to be translated. It took a long time. The discussion was just weighed down by this. But there's the general lack of comprehension that goes with a lack of understanding of the languages. And I think, for example, in the West, we still are in a critical state as far as language goes, language competence goes related to the Middle East. But it goes back a long way, and we still haven't really come to grips with it. When the Iranian Revolution occurred, my understanding is there were very, very few, only a handful of people on the very large staff of the American embassy in Tehran who had a working knowledge of Persian or Farsi. This is really unbelievable, but it's a consistent pattern in American history that we just don't know enough about these places. We don't speak the languages. When we're seeking information about what's going on in a country there, in Iran, for example, we were dependent upon reports from the Shah's government, which, needless to say, misrepresented things a little bit. The revolution was never going to occur. These were just a bunch of ragtag mullahs. What power could they possibly have? Well, we learned eventually that they had considerable power. I've already mentioned the Sorry State of Arabic translation publishing, so it's mutual. It's on both sides. The sides are not understanding each other as much as they should. There's another serious factor in the Middle East, I think, that causes problems, and that is the existence of, pound for pound, some of the worst governments on the face of the globe. Deceptive Middle Eastern governments that have signally failed in their policies toward their people. They have not created vibrant economies. They have not granted democratic rights or human rights to their people. And so what they are often into to distract attention from that is scapegoating and finger-pointing. If something is wrong in our country, it's because Mossad did it, or it's because the CIA did it. It's because of American foreign policy. That's why we can't grant you the right to vote in municipal elections. And there's no free press permitted in most of these places, really, to challenge the government's doctrine. A few years ago, there was a case where a cattle disease broke out in southern Iran, and the Iranian government announced that CIA operatives were dropping into the country and injecting the cattle with anthrax. There's nobody in the country who dares come out and say, this is stupid. This is so unlikely. Do you have any evidence for this at all? Now, another problem on the Western side. The fact is that U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War, and Arabs and Muslims have been pointing this out for quite some time now, allied us with some pretty oppressive regimes. Now, in retrospect, thinking about it, I'm not sure exactly what else we could have been doing. The policy was one of containment, if you recall, trying to contain the Soviet threat, and so you made alliances with whoever you had to in order to do that, and sometimes we had to hold our noses to do it. There were some pretty obnoxious groups out there that we made alliances with. You may think that that was a very wise policy, wise way to go. You could argue that. I think actually you can make a good case for it having been a good policy in a sense, but there's no escaping the fact that it then allied us with repressive regimes in the Middle East, and that now our protestations that were in favor of democracy and human rights ring hollow to a lot of people in the Middle East. They say, if you really believed in freedom and human rights, why were you allied with such and such a government? And we can't deny that we were, and it makes us look hypocritical. And so they don't believe us when we come in and we say, we want to establish human rights here, we want democracy for you. They say, look, you've had the chance for decades. we see ourselves in the West, in the United States, certainly. We see ourselves as allied with principles of human rights. We're, after all, in here, the country of the Declaration of Independence. Why shouldn't everybody be happy to receive our help? But they don't trust us, because we have a historical record coming out of our war with Soviet communism that has compromised us in the eyes of these people. Again, I say, I don't necessarily fault, say, the Eisenhower administration for that policy, but I do think we have to recognize quite cool-headedly that is, in fact, an implication of the policy we followed. And obviously, there's the question of Israel, American support for Israel, which has often been described as a kind of American aircraft carrier in the Middle East. It's our forward base, our strongest ally. This is all true, in a sense. And yet I remember a few years ago when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was required to resign, when he raised aloud the question, sort of musing to himself, whether our alliance with Israel was more a strategic asset or a strategic liability. That's a really good question, actually, it seems to me, because people in the Middle East, governments in the Middle East, historically have a pretty strong reason to have wanted to ally themselves with us rather than with the Soviet Union, but because of our support for Israel, they saw themselves thrust into the arms of the Soviet Union, and that's had long-term historical repercussions, which we're still living with. And Arabs and Muslims generally are still very, very upset with the fact that Israel survives to a large extent on American aid, and that the weapons that are being dropped on them in many cases are American-made. They have "Made in America" written on them. And they don't forget that. And so even Arabs who are friendly or inclined to be friendly will first always feel the need to give you a lengthy discourse on American foreign policy when you sit down with them. I've experienced that a number of times, and there's not much to do except to smile and then hope that it passes. It's sort of like, for a non-Mormon, it's sort of like the drinking of tea before the real conversation. It's just a rite of passage. Another problem that we have is our failure to tell our own story, we're telling it badly to the extent that we're telling it. Many people in the West, or in the Middle East, know many things, as I've said before, about the Western world that aren't so. They think, for example, that we're really engaged in a war against Islam. Now, there are some people out there, particularly some conservative Christians, who would be happy if that were true. These are the same people I deal with in my other career as combator of anti-Mormons. Same people who write anti-Muslim books write anti-Mormon books. It's quite amazing, and they're of exactly the same quality. But the fact is that people in the Middle East know a lot of things about us that are not so, and we're not really correcting them. We're allowing Al Jazeera to tell our story. We're allowing various magazines and newspapers in the Middle East, which are right now in a state of poisonous anti-Americanism, to be telling our story, and we are not doing a very good job of responding. Some years ago, a friend of mine who serves as a general authority contacted me. He had an experience, or had a career behind him in broadcasting into the Islamic, or into the Eastern Bloc. Wanted to know if I would be interested with the coming in of the new Bush administration in serving on an advisory board for foreign broadcasting for the United States. At first, my response was no. I live in the Middle Ages. I really, really hate coming forward. Anything, to my mind, after about 1300 is journalism. But then I thought to myself, well, actually, this is important. So I'd be willing to do it. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more excited I became. Thought it was really important. Now, nothing ever came of it. I have no idea what happened. But the more I thought about it, this got me thinking, the more I've paid attention, and the more disgusted I am with what we do or don't do in terms of telling our story. At one point, I read of a decision where some genius, had decided that, well, we didn't need to fight a war of ideas with them. We need to fight a sort of subliminal war of culture. And so we need to broadcast American culture into the Middle East to appeal to the young people in particular. And so one of the weapons of choice was Britney Spears. I'm not making this up. Now, to me, if you want to reinforce all those Muslim stereotypes about the United States, you could not choose a better vehicle than Britney Spears. I mean, this was before her most recent crash, but still, it's really appalling and unbelievable. And so the war of ideas is being waged pretty much one-sidedly, it seems to me. And there are a lot of things out there that people think they know about the West that are simply not so. A number of years ago, I had the experience of getting a call from, I need to quit soon, getting a call from the head of church hosting, the then head of church hosting, who was a former congressman. It's a fun story. Let me just tell it to you really, really quickly. he wanted me to come up to Salt Lake that Sunday to help with a group of visiting Saudis who were going to be visiting Temple Square during the Tabernacle Choir broadcast. And I got up there expecting the usual group of fairly westernized Saudis, but these guys looked like Taliban. And it turned out they were religion teachers from rural Saudi Arabia, and they'd never been outside. I couldn't tell. I think never outside of Saudi Arabia itself. Certainly never out of the Arab world. And here they were in Salt Lake City, which I thought was astonishing. They could speak no English. It was really a very interesting thing. We sat down first tried to sit down on the VIP bench in the Tabernacle, and you can see this is a while ago. But there was no room because Senator Hatch and Secretary Norman Mineta were sitting there right in the middle, and so our congressman host walked down and asked them to move, and they moved, which astonished the Saudi sitting next to me. He said, in my country this would never happen. You wouldn't dare ask them. If you asked them, they'd have you arrested, and they wouldn't move. So he was very interested in that. Then out came the Tabernacle Choir, men and women sitting separately, and he was really impressed by that. He said, "Oh, is this part of your religion?" And I said, "Well, no, not actually. It has to do with the music." So they've never heard choral music in Saudi Arabia. They don't listen to it. Their musical tradition is very different. And I could see that I was losing a friend, so I immediately said, "Well, actually, there is a building not far from here where we do sit separately." So I regained his friendship. But then we took them over to the museum, and it was really interesting. I began to realize why they were there. And I said to one of the State Department handlers that was there, this was really good to bring them here because they see a city that is literally centered on a religious shrine, that is built on a religious history and a religious foundation. And all sorts of stereotypes I can see are just dropping away from them. And the State Department fellow said, that's why we brought them here. And my respect for the State Department soared. I thought that was really, really clever and insightful, making the point that America is not the irreligious place that they think it is. And they actually thought we were just a bunch of amoralists, a bunch of immoralists, a bunch of agnostics and atheists. And so it's a very important thing that we tell them that not only is religion strong in the United States, but Islam is strong in the United States. We took them to the mosque, and the imam, we couldn't have paid him to speak better than he did. He went on and on about how well received he felt in Salt Lake City, how supported he had been, how the church had been friendly to him, and on and on and on. It was very, very good. Now, some other very quick points. The rise of fundamentalism is a major problem in the Islamic world, the rise of Wahhabism, and of course petrodollars funding madrasas which spread that kind of doctrine, which is not, in my view, mainstream Islam. They're misreading the lessons of the past. They're trying to go back to a form of Islam that was never the one that was successful in the past. It's a very, very anti-historical, anti-intellectual form of Islam that I think is extremely dangerous and doesn't represent the best of the tradition. They've misread the Afghan war. They see Islam as having been weak, and then finally the Mujahideen came in, fought the Soviets and brought the Soviet Union down. There's no notice of John Paul II or Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher or any of that sort of thing. It was the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and so if they brought the Soviets down, they can bring down the United States as well. Meanwhile, on the other side, Western secularism has failed to grasp, now I think it's beginning to realize, the strength of religiosity in the Middle East. Remember the old line of Stalin when someone said to him, if you do such and such, you'll come into collision with the Pope? And Stalin's response was, how many divisions has the Pope? Well, now we know. The Pope has lots and lots of divisions. The Kremlin has fallen, and the papacy is still there. When the Pope went to Poland, it was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union and for the Soviet bloc. I think for a long time we didn't recognize the power of religion. The Western ruling class, the elite class, is largely secular, and it just didn't understand that religion really could motivate people, and that it was still a powerful force. If these societies became prosperous, they would lose their religiosity too. Okay, well, I'm running out of time. My wife told me I would, and she was right. The West at this point is losing all of its conviction, it seems to me. I was going to talk about the rise of Eurabia, or Europistan, as some people have called it, as Europe fails to reproduce itself and becomes an Islamic continent, or at least major Islamic cities. It reminds me of the line from, and I don't mean to say that Muslims are bad. I do not feel that way, let me be clear, but in many ways it's the worst features of Islam that are most vocal and most prominent right now. It reminds me of the line from William Butler Yeats' poem where he says, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. That right now, for example, there's a case in Germany you may have heard of where a German judge basically has deferred to Sharia law to allow a Muslim living in Germany to beat his wife with impunity. And there are screams of horror justified from German lawyers and others, human rights activists, who are saying, are we going to allow Sharia law on wife beating to trump German law? It's being done in the name of cultural sensitivity, but it seems to me a culture that does that has lost its self-confidence. I think I'll leave it there. I was going to raise the issue of Benedict XVI and the idea of reciprocity, but I won't, because I've already run over time. I'm really sorry about that. Thank you very much.